Hey guys, this is Courtney from Willows Bloom. Today we have a video on Pluto, introducing it through all of the signs. And the reason I'm giving this to you guys is because I want you to get a sense of our history and how Pluto has actually designed our history in some ways. Because you'll see with my little graphic that I'm going to put here on the screen, Pluto is a planet that spends roughly 20 years in a sign. It will vary pretty drastically from sign to sign, and you can see how long it spends in each sign with this graphic. But when it moves into the sign of Aquarius, which is going to dip into in 2023, we're going to get a little taste of what the next 20-year cycle will be. And it's not going to actually fully transition and stay in Aquarius until 2024. So I'm giving you guys a preview of what this looks like throughout history. And this is such an important transit because Pluto is the slowest moving planet. It's the furthest away. Yes, I know we don't technically consider a planet in terms of astronomy, but in astrology, it's very much a planet. And it typically has to deal with this kind of death and rebirth cycle. And whenever we have Pluto transits come up, it will often bring about intense experiences where there can be a little bit more of extremes. So we can see if there was some hidden issues existing, it will bring those up to the surface and usually make them more extreme. And because of that, it puts us almost like this pressure on us to change and evolve in that area of our lives. And so it, as Pluto moves through each individual sign, will completely change that area of life in society associated with that sign. And especially if you guys have any planets in any of the fixed signs, you guys are going to have the biggest transformations because Pluto will then be either squaring or opposing or conjunct those planets. So this is just going to be such a big deal. And I wanted to give you guys kind of the backdrop, the historical backdrop. This video comes from my course on astrology. So if you're interested in that, definitely message me down below. And this is actually a precursor to a video that I'm going to put up next week, which is a deep dive into the Pluto and Aquarius transformation. And this is with my friend and fellow astrologer, Taryn, who is super popular over on TikTok. So definitely go check her out. I'll link her down below. But anyway, if you guys like that video that we show next week, it's only, I think, an hour and a half. And there is so much more that we could say. So if you guys want a part 2, definitely let us know in that video. And then definitely check this one out as well, so you guys kind of have an idea of what Pluto even is and what it has been historically. And I can't wait for you guys to see this. All right. So as I mentioned, Pluto is in a sign for around 21 years on average. And so that means that everyone in that 20-year span is going to have this. So not really that big of a deal or super personalized to have Pluto in a specific sign for you. And so what I'm going to do is kind of talk about the generation that influence brings. And we can really see this actually in the historical things that happened at the time and the energy of the time. It kind of imprints. And that, of course, is embodied in the individual, but it's like a drop in a bucket or drop in the ocean, I should say. So the Pluto and Aries generation was from 1822 to 1853. And this is a generation of the Wild West in the United States. And when we think about Aries, we think about the ram, we think about Mars, which is the planet that rules Aries. All of these elements are related to things that kind of go after what they want. It's the pioneer, it's the individualist, the person with the fighting spirit. They have this fiery aspect of themselves, maybe getting a little bit hot-headed at times as well. And so Pluto in Aries has that kind of stamp of energy during this time. And so when we think of the Wild West, we definitely think of a pioneer and an individual, someone who is taking a risk, which is very Mars and Aries energy, taking a risk to pursue something for themselves, to create something for themselves, and not really knowing how it's going to work out. And sometimes it led to violence. Sometimes it led to corruption of leadership at this time. But it was in the name or the spirit of this kind of self-exploration. This, again, was the time of self-exploration. So kind of figuring out what you desire. And Aries is linked to Mars and our animal instincts. So it's not just my human side, the side that's very civilized. It's the part of me that's very basic and instinctual, and kind of goes after what I want in that way. That's why it can sometimes lead to violence. And so there's also this element of like willpower and fruition of the self. And I think I'm saying this wrong, but Nietzsche was a philosopher at this time, and he was talking about existentialism and the act of finding oneself. So he was born with Pluto and Aries in his chart. And so we can definitely see this in his philosophy of like, what makes me me? What makes me pursue my desires and have my own willpower? So that's just a common theme of this time. Pluto and Taurus was the generation of 1852 to 1884. And this was a time of Albert Einstein. So he was born with this. And this was a generation concerned with discovering the truth around the material world and also how we manage the material world. So Taurus is related to the earth. It's related to money, finances, property. And so we can start to see a revolution or a transformation, or again, truthfulness that come in around these areas. And so Albert Einstein was a popular physicist, and he had many theories. He discovered many things about the natural world, especially related to his theory of relativity, and quantum physics, I believe. And so he was part of this whole revolution around the physical material world. Also during this time, slavery was abolished by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. And I know this is really, effed up to say, but obviously during that time, slavery was considered this type of physical resource. And so there was a complete transformation or overhaul of the existing power that kept this physical resource in play, and then allowed people to see slaves obviously as other individuals, other people with their own will and power. And so that autonomy kind of came in during this time as well. Pluto and Gemini generation was from 1882 to 1914. And when we think about Gemini, we think about the spread of information, and it doesn't necessarily have to always be the truth. It's just someone's perspective. And Gemini is very open to all the different perspectives. And so this can be a time when we see Pluto where corruption can come into play through the spread of information. And Pluto also tends to bring out the truth of things. So while it can bring out the worst, it can also bring out the light and the truth. It just usually takes a lot of time to go through that massive transformation. And so during this time, we can see the spread of information grew. So new technologies were developed that allowed people to connect with ideas from people across the world. So this is when the telephone became popular and was in every home. This was when the radio was invented. This was when magazines were widely distributed everywhere. And then if we can look at Hitler, for example, we can see that obviously one of the reasons he was able to gain so much power and influence was because of the propaganda that he put out, the misinformation, the lies about Jewish individuals that he put out. And so you can see with someone Pluto and Gemini how it can go into a kind of manipulative place and using the power of words for evil and corruption. And so that is a possibility, but there's also the possibility of doing something good with this as well. Pluto in Cancer generation was from 1914 to 1939. And when we think about the sign of Cancer, we think about the element of women, motherhood, the home, as well as things that you do to take care of people within the home. So like food and things like that. And then Cancer is also going to be linked to not just our familial home, but our national home. This idea of national identity or nationalism became much more prominent at this time. So these were the years that Hitler was in power and World War II was going on. And so we can kind of see this fascism and this nationalism really coming into play there. But on a more United States level, we were focused on transforming the role of the woman and what the relationship, what our relationship to women was. So I think Marilyn Monroe is a great example of this, who transformed the ideal beauty standards at the time and redefined them to fit a more fuller figure, which I think was a big deal at this time, even though it might not seem like a big deal now. I think that it put a lot of constraints on women to look and act a certain way. And I think Marilyn Monroe started to help redefine what a woman was and what beautiful was. And if you've ever seen, I think it's like Marvelous Miss Maisel or something like that on Amazon, they have this scene where she woke up every morning and would like measure her waist with a tape measure to make sure she stayed the absolute same size, even after having a child, for her husband. And then he ended up cheating on her anyway. But I think that's such a great example of the pressure put on women's beauty standards at the time. So during this time, women were finally able to vote. And the Roaring 20s actually occurred as well, which also started to challenge the gender roles of women. And homes were prospering around this time. So the Roaring 20s, things were going good economically. People, I think canned foods were being invented. So people were eating well. Homes were prospering at this time, even though it was taking place during World War II. Pluto in Leo generation, I think that, I don't know, I don't want to get into politics, but Pluto in Leo can be this kind of like proud generation where there tends to be desire for more visibility. I think Donald Trump is a good example of that, of someone who wants to have power and influence in leadership. And there can be a distortion of those individuals or an exaltation of leaders and other stars. So it's like the rise of the celebrity or the rise of the leader that's put on a pedestal or knocked down from their pedestal based off of how Pluto swings, which extreme. And so this was a time when Hitler finally lost his power and his atrocities became very clear for everyone. So he was dethroned in a way, which is very Pluto in Leo. Leo is also the sign related to children. And so during this time, World War II ended, there was a huge boom in having children because people were starting to prosper again. And so this brought about a whole new life, like the baby boomers. And so that is very characteristic of Pluto in Leo. And then also during this time, this was when it was the golden age of Hollywood. And it sort of created these big film stars who were very romanticized and lifted up in society, as well as kind of solidified the way in which movies are still made today. So definitely a time of stars. Pluto and Virgo generations from 1956 to 1972. And Virgo is a sign associated with being of service. It's also a sign associated with modesty. And so the exact opposite of Leo, as well as health, a strong focus on health and perfectionism. And so Pluto and Virgo people are generally going to be concerned with transforming this idea of service and being of service to not only society, but also to the planet, because Virgo is an earth sign. It is concerned with physical resources or how the earth is maintained. And so during this time, that is actually when Greenpeace was established in order to obviously benefit the earth. And it's also when Medicare was established. So again, this transformation or concern with the health and well-being of the people. And this was also a time that was marked with progressive ideals. And that's because during this generation, Uranus actually made a conjunction with Pluto in the years 1964 to 67. So we know from our previous video that Uranus is a planet of technology, of innovation, of progression. And so whenever Uranus aligns with Pluto, which is rare, we see that there is some kind of like technological boom. So during this time, it's not just about Virgo-ness, it's also about kind of Aquarian Uranus energy as well. And so this era is marked with a different type of energy than a Pluto and Virgo typically would be. And so we get to see the invention of the internet, the birth of the supercomputer, our first emails were being sent, ATMs were created. So all these different ways in which we are connected as a society, which is very Uranus energy, but in a very practical, service-oriented way, which is Virgo. So how are we making use of this? You know, the ATMs are extremely useful. The internet's extremely useful. It's kind of internet being of service to society, not just connecting one another, but doing something to kind of promote our wealth as a country or our potential as well. Pluto and Libra generations from 1971 to 84. And this was one that focused highly on equality. And that's what Libra is all about. It's about relationships, balance, harmony, equality. It has to do a lot with the legal systems and human rights, as well as Aquarius does as well. And so when Pluto is in Libra, we tend to see a transformation of these human rights to create some more balance. And so this was when abortion was legalized. This was when divorce became normalized in all the states in the US. And this was also when gay rights started to become at the forefront of society. So some really, really big movements in terms of our modern day society and what we kind of now take for granted, except in Texas. But yeah, that's something that was established during this era. And I think Angelina Jolie is also a great example of an individual with Pluto and Libra, because she's a human rights activist, and she has paired with Amnesty International. And I don't know if she wrote the book, but her name is on it. It's to promote a book about children's rights. And it literally has like the word rights on the cover. So definitely a good example of somebody who cares about the rights of everyone, even children who people might not necessarily think of. Pluto in Scorpio generation, this is my generation, is from 1983 to 95. And this is where Pluto is at home in. So there can be kind of this draw to the things that is represented by Pluto or by Scorpio, which tends to be a little bit, again, more occult or taboo or dark in nature. So they are going to be interested in those type of topics a lot more. And you can see with my generation that there was a huge increase in interest in things like astrology, like look at what I'm doing now, or things like, spells or witchcraft or anything like that, because people started to turn away from the traditions and the purity, I should say, of like Christianity, even though it's not pure, but the idea that it gives across, and come to things that feel more, more in line with manifestation and more in line with their interests, their modern interests. And so, you can see like a really big shift away from this kind of way that our parents were when it came to traditions and religion, in order to gravitate towards something that felt more real to us. And then this also brought about a greater popularity in the darker aesthetic. So things like punk or goth became a thing. Horror movies were a thing. So you can definitely see more like grunge happen during this time as well. So those things became the norm. And then also Scorpio is very much associated with sexuality as a sign. And so this was actually the height of the AIDS epidemic, and millions of people were dying around this time. So obviously that's calmed down significantly. We found a lot of health solutions for that. But this era of Pluto and Scorpio brings about a lot of those kind of sexual diseases or sexual issues. Pluto and Sagittarius, this is the generation after me, I should say, from 95 to 2008. And Billie Eilish is someone who has Pluto and Sagittarius. And Sagittarius is a sign concerned with religion and philosophy and foreign travel. And there's a lot about like dogma or what they believe is true. So I say dogma because usually when someone thinks something is true and they have all this ideology behind it, it can turn dogmatic, because Pluto can be, again, an extreme planet. And so one of the things that we see with this was, for example, 9/11, where there was this kind of, there was obviously an attack, and there was religious differences and philosophies, but it was so much more than that. It created this huge fear around what was foreign. And Pluto represents fear. Sagittarius represents foreigners, foreign travel. And so it became this kind of thing as a society where we started to really judge others or shut down other people, using that as like a verb, to other someone, where anything different or anyone that looked different or acted different or was from a different place became a threat or became scary. And so that's kind of emblematic of this time. This, again, Sagittarius is very similar to Gemini in spreading information. So Gemini tends to just share information openly, whereas Sagittarius is more so like sharing accumulated knowledge through teaching. So it's not just passing ideas through chatting, but this kind of teaching and learning. And so we can see how this became really available to everyone when the internet swept all the information up and put it online. And so it's almost like all of the books and the things that people usually taught and usually learned became revolutionized and transformed by becoming available anywhere on your phone through Google. And so, yeah, Pluto in Sagittarius gives that potential for learning anything online in any moment. Pluto in Capricorn is the current generation we're in from 2008 to 2024. And Capricorn is related to our existing structures in society. So our current rules and regulations, our current traditions, our current hierarchies, our current government, the way that businesses are set up and operated. So kind of anything that has some type of traditional structure to it. And so Pluto is coming here to transform those things. And we can obviously see that with what we just witnessed with coronavirus. What is something that will touch the world and influence the way that we structure our world and society, and influence the type of rules and regulations we have, and change the existing traditions? Well, a pandemic would do that. And so you can see that, a lot of us began to work from home. There were all these new health regulations, things that we had to follow in order to access things that we normally could have the freedom to access in any moment. So there's definitely more power influenced over us, because Capricorn is a lot about that hierarchy and kind of being forced to do things or being told what to do, even if it's, for someone's benefit or being done with fear, because Pluto is a fear-based planet. So that's obviously something that affected everyone on a huge scale. And then we also saw back in 2008, when Pluto first went into Capricorn, the market crash. So again, Pluto is strongly linked with finances, especially in the US. So back on this year, we could see that huge transformation of the structure of the way that we were giving out mortgages and things like that. And our financial institutions were affected. And then also we saw Brexit happen during these years. And so kind of reforming the structure with the UK and the European Union and the way that that looked for that country. So really big deal. Upcoming next, we have Pluto in Aquarius, which will happen in 2024 to 2044. The previous one was in 1778 to 1798. And so we're gonna kind of predict what might happen in the next one, and then also what happened in the last one. So Pluto in Aquarius, this is generally going to be people who are concerned with transforming the group identity. A lot of this will happen through revolutions and just kind of being much more progressive, especially using technology or looking at life in the world in a completely different way. So this is probably the time when we're going to experience some of the greatest amounts of change or have the most radical change in the shortest period of time. So for example, in terms of revolution, we saw both the American and French revolutions occur during this time. So it is possible that in the next 20-year span from 2024 to 2044, we could experience another revolution, especially considering as how we're going through a US Pluto return right now, which is transforming our financial system and likely weakening it. And I think that it's going to make way for some kind of revolution because Pluto is strongly linked with our fear. Fear comes from not having security, and security in the modern day is finances. So that's why all these things, whenever the finances start to go, it's very likely that restructure is going to emerge, and restructure comes through revolution many times. So I do think that in this next generation, we could have a revolution. I also think that we could especially see AI technologies advance or become much more predominantly used in society. And so I think that AI on a high level, I know that it already exists. And so it's just really a matter of integrating it and then society being transformed by it. And so I definitely think in that next 20-year span, it's going to become much more commonplace and revolutionize our relationship with the workplace as a result. And honestly, revolutionize our relationship with everything, but especially the workplace, because I think it could displace people, which we can already start to see happening with, self-checkout in Walmart and Target, all these places. It's starting to displace jobs already. And so anything that is more task-based or more menial or doesn't require necessarily specialized skill could be replaced during this time. And then we have to kind of figure out what's next after that. And so Pluto in Aquarius definitely could bring that. And in the past, in 1778 to 98, this was kind of focusing more on, again, those revolutions and just being different from society at that time. And Queen Elizabeth is a great example. She was born with this. She was obviously the Queen of England, and she was expected to get married and have kids and sort of pass along the throne. But she never did. She even had several courtiers, several people interested. I think she maybe dabbled here and there, but she never committed to anyone. She never fell prey to the pressures of her role. And so she was actually known as the Virgin Queen. And it was quite rebellious in this act of not doing what was expected of her. And so I think that Pluto in Aquarius is really embodied by her desire to just be authentic to her nature. And then lastly, we have the Pluto in Pisces generation, which is going to be a while from now, 2044 to 2068. It was previously the Pluto in Pisces generation in 1797 to 1823. So that's when Abe Lincoln was born. And this was a generation concerned with transforming spirituality, mysticism, art, imagination, dreams, water, altruism, all sort of Pisces topics. So anything related to the ethereal world, the energetic world, and especially the creative world, because that's what Pisces really stands on. And so we can see some evolution in those areas at this time. So one example, since Pisces is a water rule sign, is that the steamboats were invented during this time. So this is going to make long distance travel through the oceans much easier, much more practical. And so that was birthed during this time. It was also when the Romantic period was in full bloom. So this changed the way that people looked at art and looked at the world and the philosophy of life to be much more idyllic and dreamy and romantic in nature, which is all Pluto energy. And so we can really see that. So it'd be interesting to see this come way again in 2044 and see kind of what that brings our society when people start to open up their imagination to things that they haven't seen in a while.